What U.S. policy is most in need of protesting right now?
I would say the attacks on higher ed and research funding.
I have to say immigration. The way ICE is carrying out these raids in Southern California most recently, but in the country in general, I think it's outrageous.
This is Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions, a show that brings you conversations about the news we can't stop thinking about. I'm sadly not Dana Milbank. I'm Molly Roberts, and I'm hosting today's show while Dana is away. This week, we're tackling the news out of Los Angeles, where protests over immigration raids have led to President Trump unilaterally sending in the National Guard and, more recently, the Marines, bypassing state and local authorities. The streets are teeming with confrontations. Think torched robo-taxis, tear gas, rubber bullets shot at journalists. Less dramatic, but no less consequential, are battles in the courts. California Governor Gavin Newsom has sued the Trump administration over the escalation. Trump, for his part, endorsed a proposal to arrest Newsom. Why is this conflict erupting now? And does it mark any sort of turning point in Trump's war on immigrants? What does it mean when an American president sends the message that protests, even peaceful ones, won't be tolerated? I've got two of my colleagues here to talk through all of this.
I'm James Hohmann. I'm a member of the editorial board here.
And I'm León Krauze. I'm a columnist at the Post.
Thank you both for joining me. So, the Trump administration has been laser-focused on rounding up and deporting immigrants for months now. These roundups are oftentimes followed by protests. But why did the situation in Los Angeles erupt more than any other has since Trump retook office?
They're trying to hit their numbers, and they're not hitting them, and so they're getting more aggressive about going to places like Home Depot just to get people. And I think, early on, obviously Trump ran on mass deportation now. That was a sign that people were waving at the Republican convention, but there was an emphasis on violent criminals. And in this case, it seems like they've been sort of trying to round up nonviolent, undocumented immigrants.
And Leon, what do you think? Why so much action now? Why are so many people so visibly, physically upset and out on the streets this time?
Molly, I think the reason is very clear. And what's behind these protests in Los Angeles are Friday's ICE raids. The way they were carried out, the people they targeted, where they took place, the fact that ICE chose to go into the fashion district in downtown Los Angeles, the fact that ICE chose to go into a parking lot of a Home Depot where the most vulnerable among the most vulnerable gather every morning to seek a job for the day, an honest job for the day. This is the reason why Los Angeles reacted the way it reacted. We are talking about a city that's 47% Latino. This is the city with the second largest Mexican population in the world, the largest Salvadorian community outside of El Salvador. This is a diverse, plural, Hispanic, immigrant, and yes, Mexican city. And ICE has come into this community to tear it apart. That explains the reaction.
Yeah, you describe all those things, and it sounds a little bit to me like, wow, the Trump administration really was asking for it. Governor Newsom has said there's plenty of law enforcement on the ground in LA doing a plenty good job addressing any crime or violence that has cropped up. But Trump just wanted a spectacle. Do you think that's true? Was Trump looking for this many people on the streets?
I think it's policy and politics. He does want to round up immigrants or undocumented immigrants, and he does want to hit 1 million this year. He, I think, relishes this fight. He thinks that the visuals look great for him, people waving Mexican flags. Polls that came out over the weekend showed a majority of Americans support his deportation efforts. And the president feels like this is the thing that he won a mandate on in 2016 and in 2024. And so he thinks that this is a great fight to have. It lets him push the boundaries of claiming executive power and shows that he's taking action and doing something about immigration. I think that the pushback validates, in his view, what he's doing.
Yeah, what do you think, Leon? What are Trump's motivations here?
The wrong ones. The National Guard doesn't help in rounding up immigrants. It does help in adding fuel to the fire. Listen, I was in downtown LA on Monday. spent hours upon hours with the protesters in front of the Federal Building. They were chanting slurs, they were yelling at the National Guard and at the police, they were carrying signs that were vulgar. There wasn't one single moment in which I felt in danger. There wasn't one single act of violence on Monday while I was there. This doesn't mean that there weren't scattered acts of vandalism during the weekend, but the vast majority, in my experience, having been there, of the people who were gathered were doing it peacefully to protest ICE and its policies. It was completely unnecessary to call in the National Guard, let alone the Marines. The LAPD is a serious organization. I don't need to tell you that when you look at history. It has thousands upon thousands of officers, and it has the situation under control. The only reason why the National Guard is here is to add fuel to a very combustible and dangerous fire. It is an irresponsible decision.
Right. I mean, I guess it's useful to talk about, like you mentioned, the history here and the context here. I think this is the first time that the National Guard has been federalized without a request from a state's governor since 1965. And in 1965, it was LBJ sending troops to Alabama to protect civil rights demonstrators. Obviously, what Trump is doing here is not that. It's kind of the opposite. More recently, when the National Guard has come into a state, it's been the governor who requested the calling in of the National Guard. So that happened in Los Angeles after the killing of Rodney King, and it happened in Minneapolis after the killing of George Floyd. So this does seem unprecedented in a lot of ways. I think the question of the optics is a little more difficult, though. I'm curious, from your guys' point of view, who's winning here on that front? Whom does this look worse for, Trump or the protesters, given everything that's happening on the streets?
Well, I think the imagery hasn't helped. I think the way that the media has presented what's been going on hasn't helped either. I imagine most Americans, or many Americans, have the impression that we are talking about a widespread protest, riots all over the city like we saw in 1992. This is so far from the truth that I find it laughable. We are talking about 10 blocks in downtown Los Angeles. Downtown Los Angeles is a gigantic city, to say the least. Still, those images from the weekend of cars burning have certainly ingrained themselves, I imagine, in American public opinion. And that's where I suggest the media should come in and give this some perspective. Because this sort of imagery and this sort of narrative is feeding the rhetoric from the White House, which is unhinged. I'm sorry, but it is. To say that this city is in the midst of an invasion or an insurrection, when what's happening as of now, the moment we're recording this podcast, is mostly peaceful protests that is circumscribed to 10 blocks in downtown Los Angeles, is deranged. But that's the message that's coming out from the White House. This doesn't match reality.
Trump is winning the messaging war right now, but what I'm worried about is what comes next. We continue to see worrisome escalation rhetorically, but also sending in the Marines. Gavin Newsom is saying that he's going to file another lawsuit against the government, which is obviously different than threatening to arrest him and him saying, bring it on. But when you start sending young Marines into an urban environment with unclear rules of engagement, even if they're doing support back-end roles so that you don't have to invoke the Insurrection Act, all it takes is one accidental discharge. All it takes is one person losing their cool. I mean, there's a long history in the United States going back to the Boston Massacre, which was essentially a riot in Boston over tariffs. But there have been a lot of times where when U.S. troops are deployed on U.S. soil, it can become very combustible and play out in unexpected ways, whether it was the bonus army marchers here in D.C. during the Great Depression or the Ludlow Massacre when a bunch of U.S. troops went to put down a mining strike in Colorado and a bunch of women and children ended up getting killed. I'm not saying that's going to happen here, but it's a dangerous situation to put non-law enforcement people into a combustible situation that does appear to be dying down and did appear to be getting under control. So that's what I'm worried about, is where does this go?
Sure. I mean, definitely the people doing the massacring in the Boston Massacre did not win the optics war. But at that point, it wasn't really the optics that anybody cared about. Terrible tragedy had occurred. So it does seem like if Trump is asking for this, which in a lot of ways it looks like he is, that's a very risky gambit. Not just for him, but for the country.
It would turn public opinion against the president. I really do believe that if there's some incident, and we're not anywhere close to that quite yet.
Well, we're going to talk more about the implications of Trump quashing dissent, but first we have to take a quick break. Welcome back. I'm Molly Roberts, and this is Impromptu. We've already seen the Trump administration target students who were involved in campus protests over the war in Gaza. And now, the president is sending troops to an American city because people are speaking out against his policies. He's even calling them insurrectionists, which is pretty rich given, the January 6th insurrection. Does this send a message that dissent against Trump will not be tolerated? And what are the repercussions of that?
It's a great question, and it's one of the big storylines of this administration. He ran on this. He said, I will be your retribution. I will be your revenge. He's doing a lot of the things that he accused others of doing. One thing that I take a lot of heart in, though, is that the people who have pushed back have found success in the courts and elsewhere. Harvard obviously has won, at least temporarily. And then the law firms, it's not just that they've won in court. 4 law firms sued to challenge Trump's executive orders. 3 have been fully struck down. 1 has been provisionally struck down. But people are voting with their feet, which is clients are moving from firms that caved and made deals with Trump. And so are lawyers. Partners keep moving from the firms that made deals to the firms that didn't. So that gives me a lot of sort of hope that Trump may not like the dissent, but he is being held at bay and that the democracy is working.
Yeah.
I want to go back to what James was saying about how close we are to something much, much worse in Los Angeles. In the protest, I was thinking exactly the same thing. One single act of violence yesterday against the National Guard, and by act of violence, I mean someone throwing a rock, for example. Just a rock. And the National Guard responds. Then we are in mostly uncharted territory, although there are, of course, some precedents in American history, but we are in uncharted territory in our current moment. And that is the real danger. And that, Molly, is why I think we should get this story and how it has evolved or devolved correctly. We have to get the story right and assign blame where blame is due. And I have to underline, I think that the presence of the National Guard here in Los Angeles was and still is unnecessary because it opens the door to exactly the kind of situation that we've been describing that would take the United States into a scenario that the country does not want to be in and should not be in. That's the danger.
I think there's also an element of both sides sort of misreading the other. I do think Trump, he has strongman impulses and tendencies and likes looking tough, looking powerful. And I do think he and his aides believe that an overwhelming show of force has a deterrent effect, not just on migrants coming across the border, but on people protesting, when the reality, I think, is the opposite. I think it does have a deterrent effect on migrants, the way they're doing the deportations and everything. But I think that we're already seeing anti-ICE protests pop up in other cities, and it's not keeping people home. I think it is pouring fuel on the fire, and it is bringing more people into the streets, which often happens in places where there's big crackdowns on protests.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Most Americans support tightening up the southern border, but Trump's immigration policy has gone way beyond that. The raids at workplaces and Home Depots, arrests of people checking in for their immigration hearings, which just seems like the opposite of what you should be doing, the opposite of the people you should be targeting. These are folks who are trying to comply. The administration is sending plane loads of people all across the world from El Salvador to South Sudan, sometimes with no due process. They've detained people here legally on student visas, like Mahmoud Khalil. But Trump is running well behind his stated goals of deporting more than 1 million people per year. He's running well behind, if you look at the rate at which he's going, President Barack Obama's numbers, which I'm sure he does not like. It seems to me a little bit that the theatrical cruelty and extra legality is the point of what he's doing, that he's trying to send a message here, that he's trying to say, I am tough. Also, in this case, he's trying to say, this is lawlessness. I am the law. And, like you said, James, to deter immigrants from even trying to come here. But I agree. I'm not sure it's working. I don't know, Leon, whether you think that there's a real deterrent effect here or that he wins with voters or even skeptics by looking like a tough guy.
There is that effect that you're describing when it comes to immigration. I was in Tijuana recently in a couple of shelters I go to every once in a while to capture the stories of immigrants. And what the people who run these shelters are telling me is that immigrants are terrified. Less people are coming through Mexico and to Mexico's northern border than southern border of the United States. So it is having an effect. Now, when it comes to the American electorate, when I think of Republican voters, Trump voters, you hear in social media, right, this idea that this is what they voted for. I'm not so sure this is what they voted for. And I don't think many people who voted for Trump on immigration as their main agenda voted for this either. I'll give you a quick example. The recent story of this woman in Missouri who had been in America for decades and suddenly got detained by ICE. And the vast majority of voters in the town were Trump voters. And suddenly they realized the repercussions, the human toll of one specific case of unfair, unjust deportation. And the whole town reacted, and this woman was freed. I think that if the Trump administration insists in pursuing these policies in this manner against these people, sooner rather than later, we're going to see consequences in public opinion against these policies. At least that's my hope.
Both of you were talking earlier about being on the precipice of something terrible, but what you were just saying, Leon, points to being on the precipice of maybe something good, of a larger scale protest movement that is peaceful. And I suppose I'm curious, is that what you expect here? Is this the beginning of something bigger, or are this week's events in Los Angeles more of a one-off?
Well, James was referring to the scenes in a number of American cities within the last 48 hours, in Florida, in New York, in Texas. I think this is what's happening. I mean, people are seeing these families broken apart, these communities being fractured, these people detained, people who are not criminals, who have no criminal background, who are undocumented, yes, but who have built lives in this country for over years or even decades, and people are reacting. So I do think that resistance to these sort of punitive immigration policies is going to grow, is bound to grow. Whether or not the protest at large and in its most virulent form will grow, frankly, I hope it doesn't. And I hope that those who are protesting never forget that in the end, this is a moral and political battle. And the way to win both is to resist the temptation of physical violence, which would be really terrible.
To me, this feels very different than 5 years ago. That was the COVID summer, but the summer of George Floyd. And it felt like that was partly because of the video of George Floyd getting murdered, such a galvanizing thing, and people had been sort of cooped up for a couple months. But even just looking at social media, I'm not thus far seeing the kind of outpouring from normally non-political people who back 5 years ago really got engaged. And that could change, but I have been struck by the degree to which even the travel bans that were announced last week, compare the tepid response to those compared to the response to the travel bans 8 years ago. It just doesn't feel like there's anywhere close to the same energy.
Yeah, I wonder why. I wonder when we talk about energy and whether we're just out of energy, we simply got tired, or whether there isn't enough of an outrage now to galvanize people. Something more outrageous would. Because when you step back and try to just look at the situation analytically, it does seem pretty outrageous. It's ticking all the criteria of outrageousness for me. But you're right, people seem exhausted. And on that very sad note, we have to wrap this up. I really appreciate both your time and this thoughtful discussion. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Molly.
Wonderful to be here with you.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson and Regina DeHeer, edited by Demir Marusic, and mixed by Emma Munger. Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Deirdre Byrne. Thanks for listening to Impromptu. Please let us know what you think about what's happening with immigration and protest in the United States right now. Send an email to impromptu@washpost.com. And remember to tune in again on Friday. This week, Drew and I will be talking with our colleague Theodore Johnson about the military and how the meaning of military service is changing in America today. I'll talk to you then, and Dana will be back here next Tuesday.